Hello, and welcome to this episode of Trade Talks from the Global Business Dialogue. Each is a conversation on trade policy with someone who knows something about it. I'm Judge Morris, and with me today is John Murphy, Senior Vice President for International Policy at the United States Chamber of Commerce. John, who joined the Chamber in 1999, is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate from the University of Colorado, and he holds a master's from the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. John, before we get into all the challenges of today's trade policy, I thought we might go back to the early 1990s when I think you were in Czechoslovakia at 92, 93. That was a period just before the Velvet Divorce and the creation or split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So my question is, what were you doing there, and what was it like to be there at that time?
Well, Judge, it's great to sit down with you and have this conversation. I think, like many young Americans, it was a great opportunity to travel to Eastern Europe shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In my case, I went to teach economics at a university in Eastern Czechoslovakia in what later became Slovakia. It was an exciting time of change and reform. Nations liberated and an embrace of free market principles. And it was really a great experience. So I was there when the country split in two, but I always hasten to point out that it wasn't my fault.
Well, we will all do to blame for that, John. If we could move on, the Chamber is obviously an enormous, a big enterprise. I believe it's the world's largest business federation. And when the Chamber speaks, policymakers listen. I wonder if you could say a word about how all the pieces fit together, the various, there's a chamber in almost every town in America, how that comes together and you translate the concerns of individual companies into policies.
Sure. Well, as you say, the Chamber is a federation with a variety of different kinds of members. We do represent many of the Fortune 1000, but we also represent hundreds of thousands of small businesses. We represent manufacturers, service providers, and agribusiness enterprises. We include in our membership nearly 1,000 sectoral associations and more than 2,000 state and local chambers of commerce, and 127 American chambers of commerce located overseas. It's an organization that works with many partners across the business community to shape public policy. We are not special pleaders for one sector or another. Rather, we push for those policies that are going to foster prosperity for the greatest number. And I think that's true on trade policy as well.
Yeah, no, I shouldn't involve myself, but that's certainly my impression also. When you were early in the Chamber, in fact, when you and I met, you were the Vice President for Western Hemisphere. And that was a time when the US was engaged in negotiating some Latin America and major FTAs, Chile, Panama, Colombia. I wondered if you think back to that period and then forward to now and sort of give us your impression as to how those agreements have worked out, both for the countries involved and for the United States.
Yes, well, that was the period of that then U.S. Trade Representative Bob Zoellick called competitive liberalization, when the United States had a number of irons in the fire in terms of trade liberalization initiatives. There was the Doha round at the WTO. There was the free trade area of the Americas in the Western Hemisphere, but the U.S. was also negotiating bilaterally and regionally within the Americas. While the FTAA did not come to fruition, I do think competitive liberalization paid off in that by within about a decade, the United States had entered into high quality trade agreements with countries that today are purchase well over 80% of U.S. exports here in the hemisphere. And that's a real accomplishment and a strength for U.S. trade policy that benefits American companies day in and day out.
Yeah. Okay, we have to go from the good news of those FTAs to the bad news of COVID. If there's one thing that we all have in common, in a sense, it's having to deal with COVID in some fashion. I mean, from the disease itself to the Delta variant, to the masks, to the lockdowns, everyone's life's been affected. I wonder if you talk a little bit about how it's affected your work at the chamber, your interactions with members, dealings with officials, and so forth.
Sure. And the pandemic has been a common experience, but I think we've all experienced it in our own individual ways as well. For those of us in the trade community, we wound up quickly having to work on priorities that we had not previously thought about. For instance, in that first wave, lockdowns were imposed in very different ways across the United States and across different countries. And governments quickly tried to identify essential industries and workers so that the economy could continue to function and essentials like food could continue to reach consumers. Those differences between states and between countries proved highly problematic. Just to give one example, Mexico, which today is the top U.S. trading partner, had a very strong lockdown policy in place that led to many industries being closed, including facilities that were manufacturing medical supplies. So trying to work with our members to navigate those difficult times was a real challenge. In the end, we got through it, and happily, I think, even though the pandemic continues, industry and government are finding better ways to respond to the ups and downs of the pandemic. One other area I'll mention is that we saw an uptick in export restrictions for medical supplies around the world. Interestingly, including within the European Union, which of course is a single economic zone. The good news is that business and government quickly saw the costs to many of these export restrictions, and they were ratcheted back. But again, it was one of those experiences where, in new ways, we have to relearn some of the lessons of economic history about the costs of export restrictions.
Well, that sort of unfortunately leads us to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is tariffs. Back in July, the former U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer had an op-ed in the New York Times in which he argued, among other things, that the notion that all tariffs are bad is foolish and counterproductive. They have been an effective tool of economic policy since the beginning of the Republic, end quote. That leads to a couple of questions. One is, what should be done about the tariffs that the Trump administration put in place? I'm thinking particularly of the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum and the Section 301 tariffs on China. Can their administration be improved, or should they just be scrapped, or what should be done? I'll leave it at that one. And once you talk to that, and I'll go on with another refinement later if it seems appropriate.
Sure. So the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum are an interesting case study, and one that I think calls out for action today. The steel sector employs a little more than 100,000 American workers, but meanwhile, nearly 6 million American manufacturing workers are employed at establishments where steel is a critical input. These tariffs had the impact of significantly raising prices for steel in the 6 months after they were first applied. And major companies like GM and Ford indicated in their SEC filings that they were paying as much as $1 billion each in the case of those two companies in higher prices and costs. So the question is, what is the broader impact on the US manufacturing economy of tariffs that favor one small segment within that manufacturing economy? Today, those tariffs continue in place. They're a significant irritant in our international relationships. The 232 tariffs, of course, invoke national security and implicitly declare that countries such as the UK or Japan or Korea are somehow threatening American national security with these steel sales to the United States. But I think the ongoing problem, though, is the significant drag on the US economy, because the United States today is an island of high-priced steel, where the price of steel just in the past year has surged by nearly 400%, and represents a serious drag on the competitiveness of US manufacturing writ large. So I do think that's an example of tariffs that are in serious need of reconsideration. The Section 301 tariffs are a broader question. The first two lists on about $50 billion worth of imports from China came about after a careful investigation and a detailed report under the 301 process. Lists 3 and 4, which are much larger and cover hundreds of billions of dollars of imports, were imposed without any further study, and in one case, at a moment in negotiations with China that it was difficult to understand why they were being imposed. There's a strong case to be made that not all of those 4 lists should be viewed in the same way. And in any event, there's a very strong view across industry today that it's time to re-examine those tariffs and to consider whether and how to provide tariff relief to the American families and companies that are paying them. Because at the end of the day, a tariff is a tax, and it's Americans who are paying them.
Yeah, to sort of continue the tariff discussion just a bit, I wanted to look at it a little bit sort of systemically, and that was how the country works. So we have our current system is sort of this blend between different commitments. You have the WTO MFN commitment. You have the things in the US, in the bilaterals, USMCA and so forth. Then you have tariffs coming from trade remedy cases, and then the ones we just discussed, the 232, 301. And so what I'm trying to get at here is, particularly when you think of the 301 cases, that's largely handled by the administration without a lot of congressional input. So is this system adequate as it is, or does it need to be updated or replaced, the whole system of how we work things here?
Um, it's an interesting question. You know, the bedrock of the U.S. tariff code was laid in the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the 1930s, and many elements in it have not changed in the many decades since then. That is why our basic tariffs, the most favored nation tariffs in place today, have been eliminated in many categories, but in others remain high. So for instance, apparel and footwear. Prior to the imposition of the 301 tariffs, tariffs levied on apparel and footwear represented about half of all tariff revenue. So, and that's a relic of the past and not necessarily how you would write it up today if you were starting from scratch. I think we can all agree. Some of these other elements, such as trade remedies, there may be debates about how they're implemented, but the intellectual case for them to address dumped or subsidized goods remains. I think that perhaps the biggest question on all of these, though, today would be the role of Congress, which has delegated certain authorities, which are fundamentally those of the legislative branch, and debate continues on whether and how Congress should reclaim some of that authority.
Yeah, that brings us to the issue of legislation. TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority, has expired, and you're much closer to this than I am, but it certainly doesn't seem obvious to me that there's going to be any trade legislation this year. Though the Senate has passed what they call the Trade Act of 2021, which is part of, as you know, a larger bill on innovation and competitiveness. What's your assessment of that legislation, and both in terms of the provisions it contains and whether it has a chance of becoming law?
So the two core elements in the Trade Act of 2021 are bills to renew the generalized system of preferences and a new iteration of the miscellaneous tariff bill. Both of these have passed Congress in recent years repeatedly and with very large majorities. It's clear that it remains the general intention of the Congress to renew these trade programs. The question is when and how. And there's a debate about adding new criteria to GSP. And while I think most members of Congress would support some changes there, there's a debate about how far to go. And with regard to the miscellaneous tariff bill, the uncertainty is hard to understand. The miscellaneous tariff bill is assembled through a process that is very transparent and makes clear that we're talking about goods that simply aren't made in the United States, that manufacturers need as inputs, or if they are made in the United States, other industries have not objected to the suspension for 2 or 3 years of those duties. So they are in essence tariffs nobody wants. So we remain confident that the Congress will renew both of those programs this year, perhaps in connection with other legislation.
That's encouraging. We've talked about COVID and the Trump tariffs, both of which have had a profound effect on U.S. and global supply chains. And so what I wanted to talk about now, if you're willing, is the Chamber's view on the supply chain challenges and what the goals should be. For example, should we return to the way things were in 2016? Should the emphasis on reshoring and production of critical components like semiconductors in the US be the priority? Or should we simply be aiming for a greater diversity in America's source supply?
Well, that's a big question. And I think the answer depends on which sectors you're talking about. Today, many parts of America's supply chains are jammed up, but that is the result of a complex collection of circumstances. For instance, across the board, demand has risen pretty substantially, and imported goods are coming into the country at a level well above what we saw pre-pandemic. So it's partly not about supply chain snafus, but rather a demand surge. Now, there are areas, though, where the Congress is showing bipartisan interest in seeing more onshore production. This is true in some kinds of medical goods. In fact, we've already seen significant expansion of domestic production of some medical goods used in hospitals and other settings during the pandemic. Another area would be semiconductors, where there's broad bipartisan support in the Congress for the CHIPS Act, under which the United States would provide support for domestic manufacturing on par with what we're seeing countries such as Ireland, Israel, and Singapore provide to the semiconductor sector in those countries. Another area where we're seeing scrutiny is in critical minerals, including those that are needed for the energy transition and products such as electric vehicles and the batteries that run them. And that's an area where we're seeing the United States work closely with its allies to diversify supply. At the end of the day, supply chain security is greatly benefited by diversifying supply so that we're not dependent on a single source. But broadly speaking, global supply chains add to the available productive capacity and make the ability to procure needed goods easier and cheaper. And I think it's important that we continue to keep that in mind.
Yes. Okay. But to the extent that we're talking about China, about supply chains, we're often also really talking about China. So then the question gets narrowed to how integrated should the United States allow the two economies to become, or should the U.S. in a sense promote a decoupling of the two economies? And I know there are a lot of there's a range of views on that. What's yours?
Well, earlier this year, the Chamber issued a report that examined the potential costs of decoupling in a number of sectors. And what we found is that the costs would be quite high to both the Chinese and the US economies. There are indeed a number of areas where national security concerns and concerns relating to emerging technologies will continue to motivate the United States to use export controls and mechanisms like CFIUS to support U.S. industry. For many other sectors, the rationale for limiting trade between the two countries is much more tenuous. Is there a good reason why Americans shouldn't be able to purchase flooring made in China? Is there a reason why Americans shouldn't be able to buy outerwear made in China? You can go down the list. The gains from trade are significant, and that's been true since Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and for many sectors, that continues to be the case with the United States and China.
Okay. I said we go back, or at least I meant to say we go back to the FTA issue, and I just, at this point, the Biden administration has shown the marked reluctance to enter into new trade deals. And I wonder if, from your perspective, that poses a risk to America and American exporters. And so what are they? What are those risks? Might just skip ahead a little bit here with the, well, let's pause with that. I was going to ask you about TPP and things next, but we'll deal with that first question about whether you need the administration to get more engaged on trade deals.
Sure. There is some frustration in the business community and a desire to see quicker action on the trade front. The Biden administration has repeatedly signaled a desire to address a number of domestic priorities first. That includes some domestic priorities like the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which is pending in the Congress. And I think the Chamber and others support action there. But in our view, moving forward with a market opening trade agenda is part and parcel of our economic recovery plans. 40 million American jobs depend on trade. Any worker-centric trade policy needs to take into account their priorities, which include removing barriers that impede their sale of exports to markets around the world. So we're hopeful that the administration's review of the trade policies that they inherited from the last administration will conclude soon, and that the United States can move forward with a trade policy that will take into account the opportunity that trade agreements present to win better access to foreign markets, and also an approach to disentangling some of the tariffs that are in place today that have, in effect, doubled the tariff burden that American families and companies pay today.
When we look at opportunities, the one that, at least in my world, keeps coming up is TPP, or now CPTPP, and there are a lot of voices calling for the U.S. to join. But I don't know what the Chamber's position is on that, and how you look at that agreement, which is becoming central to lots of other discussions. But in any case, the real question is, how do you feel about the U.S. Trying to get back into a thing which in effect created through the TPP negotiations?
Yeah. So the U.S. Chamber strongly supported the TPP. I think any close examination of that agreement will reveal that it was that its DNA is mostly American. Former trade negotiators can go through paragraph by paragraph and divine the parentage of different stipulations and obligations. So it's an irony that it's in force and it's in force among 11 other countries, but the United States isn't taking part. I think the dilemma for the United States today is if we are not to rejoin the TPP, then what is America's strategy for economic engagement in the Asia Pacific, a region that by the year 2030 will account for 2/3 of the world's middle class. And American workers whose prospects are being prioritized by this administration have a powerful incentive to seek better access to those markets. So if it isn't the TPP, then what is the strategy?
Yeah, TPP is the big one, but I wondered if you might be willing to comment on some of the other potential deals that are out there, such as with the UK or with Kenya.
Sure. Well, the Chamber and the U.S. business community broadly strongly support moving forward with those negotiations with the UK and Kenya. It's difficult to think of a reason why we would not want to do so. There are always debates about exactly what provisions to put into the trade agreement, but that's fodder for the negotiations and not for debate over whether or not to proceed with them. The UK is, some would say America's oldest ally and a major economic partner, and continuing to maintain 20th century trade barriers between our two countries seems to serve no purpose. Kenya is a promising market in East Africa and participant in the African continental free trade area. And closer US engagement with Kenya and negotiation of a trade agreement presents an opportunity for American business to engage more in a growing continental economy where other initiatives to reduce the fragmentation that has held back African economic growth and income gains is being overcome. So we hope to see both of those move forward.
Before we leave the subject of excuse me, FTAs, I'd like to just go back for a minute to the biggest one for us, which is the USMCA. Obviously, it was important to get that done, particularly under the threats that NAFTA was under and so forth. But my question has to do with the fact that the notion of this being a very strong worker-centered and union-centered exercise is certainly come to the fore, and that may be a good thing. But I'm wondering if it is the best way to maximize the potential of USMCA.
I think the debate over NAFTA, the threat of NAFTA withdrawal, and whether and how to craft a new agreement, which ultimately became USMCA, supports the idea that it is our most important trade agreement, other than the WTO. In fact, it's so important that we couldn't do without a North American free trade agreement. From the Auto Trade Pact of the 1960s to today, the elimination of trade barriers between the US, Canada, and Mexico has been an inexorable trend, and more than 10 million jobs across North America depend on free trade. What it represents for the future of US trade policy is a conundrum, though. It is unique. It's difficult to make the same argument that a free trade agreement with any other country in the world is essential in the same way that our agreement here in North America is. And some of the features you mentioned, such as the provisions relating to worker, to union rights, it's difficult to see governments in other world regions agreeing to them. The United States had a degree of leverage with Mexico that we simply don't with other parts of the world. And so the idea that we could secure the same kinds of commitments elsewhere is unproven at best. Other features such as the rules of origin are also probably unique to North America. If you were to try to graft the USMCA auto rules of origin onto the TPP, it simply wouldn't work. The auto sector could not trade across the Pacific under those rules. So, trade agreements are crafted to fit the trade relationship, I think is one of the takeaways.
That's I'm really glad I asked that question, John, because I learned a lot from the answer. I wanted to, you mentioned the WTO a moment ago, and obviously in Geneva, they're just coming back to work now after the August break, and they've got a full agenda because they've got a ministerial conference coming up at the end of November. There's that deadline. So just if we could start, maybe just asking what your expectations are for that conference and its significance for the WTO. Yeah.
Sure. Well, it's an important ministerial for the WTO, and there's a strong desire, I think, from many, if not all, participants to show that the WTO can deliver. One priority is the fisheries negotiations, which have been underway for 2 decades. It's an area where subsidies are genuinely responsible for depletion of fish stocks. And so the nexus with environmental considerations is undeniable. I think the United States is hopeful to see something accomplished there. Other areas that are important is to begin to move from the debate over the impasse at the appellate body to solutions. As the Trump administration left office, it was common to hear that something closer to a consensus had emerged in Geneva on the need for some reforms around the appellate body. But I think the business community would like to see progress towards actually addressing those concerns. That's not an issue that's necessarily on the agenda at the ministerial conference, but it's certainly hanging out there.
The only other thing is, do you have any hope or views on the likelihood of more plurilateral agreements along the lines of, let's say, the hoped for agreement on tariff reductions for environmental goods?
I think so. There seems to be widespread interest in the United States in seeing shifting coalitions of interested parties come together at the WTO around new agreements. We do see today discussion of around e-commerce and digital trade at the WTO. It remains to be seen, though, if that is an issue where agreement can be reached, because some of the participants seem to be aiming for a much less ambitious agreement. Indeed, there seems to be there are differences of opinion over whether and how to move forward with plurilateral agreements, and we do see from time to time a certain amount of hostage taking in Geneva, where an insistence on only pursuing agreements that are truly multilateral among all the WTO membership is held up as a way to block progress among those who would like to move forward faster.
Yeah, no, it's a problem. If I could turn to two really big subjects and put them together, that is investment and taxes. I hope you'll forgive me for trying to do that, but when I was thinking about them, I mean, everything from ice cream cones to ice-breaking ships, they all begin with investments, and everything is influenced by taxes. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about those two things in terms of trade and economic development and how they interact.
Sure. Well, international investment it's a two-way street that brings significant benefits to the United States. On the inbound side, nearly 8 million Americans are employed at U.S. affiliates of foreign headquartered companies, and these companies have invested trillions of dollars in the United States. They spend hundreds of billions of dollars on R&D here in the United States. So our openness to that investment from abroad is critical to our prosperity. And on the other side, it's undeniable that Americans gain from the freedom to invest overseas as well. It's often the only way that American companies can tap foreign markets. Not everything can be exported. This includes many services, or for that matter, many manufactured goods. Many mundane manufactured goods like laundry detergent or potato chips are all consumed within a few hundred miles of where they're manufactured because it's difficult to transport them over distance. So an international investment climate where American companies can invest in foreign markets greatly strengthens American companies and makes them more resilient. More than 90% of the overseas production of U.S. companies stays overseas. So international investment, contrary to the allegation we frequently hear, isn't about moving American jobs overseas. It's frequently the only way that American companies can tap foreign markets.
Yeah, I don't know whether you wanted to touch on the taxation side where we have a little movement, or you want to leave that one.
I can speak to that quickly. It's the negotiations that have been underway under the aegis of the OECD and the G20 are important, and they're complex. The U.S. Chamber has supported the idea of a multilateral approach to some of the challenges in that area. Some of the challenges that are attracting the most attention in recent years have to do with the digitalization of the world economy. And the movement towards unilateral discriminatory digital services taxes is something that the U.S. Chamber and multiple U.S. administrations have strongly opposed. So having a multilateral approach is definitely the alternative that we hope to see. Having said that, the devil's in the details, and many issues involved in those ongoing negotiations are unsettled, and we do have ongoing concerns about some of the things we're hearing there. But we are glad that the discussions are taking place in a multilateral forum.
Thanks a lot, John. This has been really great. If I could ask you just one last question, and it's really kind of just an open-ended one. If there's something we didn't touch on, but you wish we had, or something you wanted to add to something we've already discussed, well, you've got the last word here. So what is it?
Well, I suppose I might just make a very general point. You know, to trade is human. You know, humanity has arisen from the Stone Age on the basis of specialization and exchange. You know, the village, people developed agriculture, and one fellow became a blacksmith and another became a potter. And that specialization and their ability to trade with one another in their community allowed them to raise their living standards. And that's the story of the past several thousand years. And it's that way today. And you'll hear from time to time that globalization is dead. You will see trade barriers rise and fall. But the urge to trade is never going away, because it is, you know, one of the great engines of human progress.
Thank you. I must say, I've done a couple of interviews now, and I'm always impressed by the open-ended one, where I didn't ask a question, I just found out what the person was thinking, and it's usually always very worth hearing. This was certainly no exception. So I thank you very much. This is really great. And I want to thank those who will join us, I hope, online. Watch your inboxes for the next Trade Talks episode. In the meantime, have a cup of something with someone and enjoy the conversation. Thank you.